The Victorian Era by Adam, Justin, and Eric. For our class interactive activity, we have created a crossword. Please click on the link, either pull out the activity and print it out, or just view it and complete it on a separate piece of paper. The Victorian Era. The Victorian Era was a 63-year reign of Queen Victoria, which lasted from approximately 1837 to 1901. During this time, we saw the end of the Industrial Revolution. We saw Britain rise to be the first industrial power on Earth. We also saw a revolution of technology. We saw social change, Charles Dickens, Charles Darwin, the railway boom, and the first ever telegraph and telephone. Key elements of Victorian era. The British Empire started to dominate all around Europe. Things like spiritualism and hypnotism were a very large part of their lives. Gothic novels were at their peak. It was a very dark era that had quite disturbing methods, like posing with a dead loved one with their dead corpse. These dark methods and ideas were reflected in literature in this era. There was a lot of dark and disturbing stories through this time period. Styles of writing during this era. Poems were the primary type of literature during this era, but there was also realist writing, naturalist writing, and novels floating throughout Britain. Still, poems still dominated. The era before. Transcendental era came before, and they focused on nature and the personal knowledge of God. This era was very big on supremacy of insight over logic. Intuition and imagination ruled during this era, and as a result, there was a lot of creative literature created. The deep description of nature was used in writing in a very unique way.
Now we have the era after the Victorian era. So, existentialism really focuses on the individual deciding their own life's choices and making their own decisions with no social influence. So, the idea of free choice and free idea allowed the individual to unlock their maximum potential. During this era, a very common question that they were concerned about is what the meaning of life was. Acting individually was one thing that they valued greatly, and they believed that in order for an individual to be the greatest version of themselves, they can't be bothered or influenced by others. This forced the individual to think critically for themselves. Next, we have how did the previous eras affect the Victorian era? So, the fact that individuals were not very focused on logic or reason in the previous eras really forced them into thinking logically and critically in the future. The fact that there were many important inventions during the Victorian era shows us that individuals started trusting things like science and logic more, and this led to many important inventions being created, and these inventions are still used in today's day and age. This also led to literature that focused on the facts and seeing life for how it really was instead of fantastical writing. This type of realism writing became more and more popular as time went on, and they started seeing the world for how it really was instead of imagination and romantic symbolism. So our author of choice is Robert Browning. So Robert Browning was born in London, England on May 7th in 1812. He had a wife who was also a poet and a son who was a painter. He then died in 1889 at the age of 77 years old after creating many different types of literature. Robert Browning was a well-known English poet and a playwright, and known as a huge contributor to the Victorian era of literature. Robert was mostly known for his dramatic monologues. Some of his best poems were My Last Duchess, The Ring and the Book, and Sordello. Till this day, Robert is still one of the most well-respected poets of his time, and we still appreciate his contributions. What changes happened during the Victorian era? Now, with the ending and starting of revolutions comes a lot of changing in beliefs, thoughts, ideas, and questions. This is likely the change that Britain went through during this time period. Changes to the revolution would have changed what people did for work, as well as many people might have gotten more money or became very poor because of it. At the discovery of technology, many questions likely arose, which sparked the logic question of the Victorian era. This would have started many more questions, pulling the last bit of writers and philosophers away from the transcendentalism and towards a new group of questions, resulting in the ultimate creation of the Victorian era. Overall, the revolution either really hurt you or made you a lot of money during this time period.
Robert Brown's My Last Duchess. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Wilt please you sit and look at her, I said. Fra Pandolf by design, for never read. Strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there, so not the first. Are you to turn and ask thus? Sir, 'twas not. Her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheeks, perhaps. Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faith, half flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough. For calling up that spot of joy she had, a heart how shall I, too soon made glad, too easily impressed, she liked whatever she looked on, her looks went wherever. Sir, 'twas all one. So that was about half of the poem. It's actually quite long, and I thought it would be a little boring to just read it over completely. So for the analysis, so Robert Brown's My Last Duchess. The poem My Last Duchess is told through the eyes of the Duke Ferrara. The poem is about a duke whose wife who had recently passed. There's a man one day who comes to visit the duke to negotiate another marriage. In the poem, the duke and the emissary walk past a painting of the Duchess. From there, the duke starts to talk about the past with his Duchess. He talks about how she was disrespectful and rude, and how she would flirt with any visitors they had over. We also find out that the Duke had something to do with the death of the Duchess. The two then move on and look at other artwork. This is a rhyming poem that explores the themes of hatred, jealousy, and power. These are the themes that were consistently explored throughout this time period and were in a lot of the writing. We are told this because we learn that the Duke wants to control and rule women with an iron fist. We can also see this by the way he describes his wife and how he seems not to care that she has died. And the way he describes her, he says that he does not like her very much. So our connection that we found to the Dead Poets Society was, one, the woman question was a buzzing topic that played a very large role in the Victorian era. It's brought up quite a lot in many different poems and pieces of literature. The question was if women should play a bigger role in society. This was an idea in the Dead Poets Society because they slowly started to introduce girls into the film as time went by. Like in Dead Poets Society, they're like a very traditional school, no girls, boys only, and we can start to see the switch into the next era. Women used to be only used for cleaning, cooking, and raising the kids, so that's just like another part of being quite traditional, and we start to see a change in that. Another is they slowly became a bigger part of society. So women were more involved in the community and having jobs. And it's also very similar to the way they slowly integrated girls into the film more and more as it went on. Since then, women have played a way more important role in society, like voting and contributing to society.